Nós vamos ouvir agora o DeBatto. David foi um agente especial de contra-inteligência do exército dos Estados Unidos, é veterano da Operação de Libertação do Iraque. Atualmente está aposentado, então. Atualmente ele é também coautor da série CI, que se chama Counterintelligence, da Warner Books. É autor de Contrário à Inteligência, da Prager Security International. Além disso, tem contribuído com as principais redes de notícias, analisando e discutindo a guerra contra o terror, a ocupação do Iraque e as ações das agências militares e de inteligência dos Estados Unidos. David, por favor. You have 35 minutes.
Thank you. Guten Morgen, Privet, hello, buenos dias, bom dia. That is the sum total of my linguistic ability. The only reason I'm standing, I do not have any presentation to show you. I don't have any PowerPoint, I don't have any slides, I don't have any movies, I don't have any videos. The sole reason I'm standing here is because I like to be the tallest one in the room. That doesn't happen very often. First of all, I do want to thank Nancy Cardia and Sergio Adorno, Rafael Navarro, and everyone that was involved in putting together this tremendous seminar. I'm really glad to be here among all these intellectuals and academics who have an incredible amount of expertise in this area. I was invited, I believe, as the token non-academic, I think, to keep things honest. As you can tell by my background, I am not a professor. I am a former cop, as we say in America, which was a law enforcement officer, also intelligence agent for most of my career. I retired about 4 years ago after I served in the war in Iraq, and since then I have been a writer, speaker, and a consultant. In fact, how many law enforcement officers or intelligence folks are in the audience today? It's okay, you can say. I see one, that's okay. Any more? Okay, a few, thank you. A few, thank you very much, thank you, thank you. Are there any prisoners in the audience today? If you are, please report to these gentlemen. Thank you very much. Today what I'm going to do is give a brief overview of the intelligence branch of the United States Army, as well as the Army Medical Corps, because there's been a lot of problems, at least in the United States, and I believe here in Brazil over the last few years, of medical personnel, whether in the police department or in the military, getting involved with interrogations and assisting before, during, or afterwards. And it's become a real issue in the United States, especially among psychologists, and I'm doing some work with the American Psychological Association in that regard. There's almost a civil war within that association about what should a healthcare professional's role be, if any, in interrogations. And we're going to talk about that. I'm also going to try to talk a little bit about the situation here in Brazil. I am not an expert in Brazil, obviously. This is the first time I've been in your wonderful country. But I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the parallels between what's going on in the United States with their military and with their law enforcement and what's going on here. I think in order to give some credibility to the paper, though, I do want to give just a little bit more of my background, because in my line of work anyway, if you don't have evidence and you don't have the creds, as they call it, nobody really believes you. I've spent over 27 years in a combination of civilian law enforcement and military intelligence assignments. My last assignment was 12 years in U.S. Army counterintelligence, with my last mission being in Operation Iraqi Freedom in the beginning of 2003, running through the beginning of 2004. I've served in a variety of assignments during that time in the peacetime Army of the United States, in the Army Reserves, and what we call the Army National Guard. Now, my entire career has been spent in the intelligence field in one area or another, and I originally actually started out as a German linguist, hence my Guten Morgen a little earlier. In the law enforcement field, I served for over 15 years in a combination of law enforcement assignments, starting from a uniformed patrol officer, working my way up to be director at one point of major crimes investigations, and along the way I've been an instructor and curriculum developer both in the law enforcement and the intelligence areas. As I said, I originally trained as a German linguist in the United States Army and served in Germany for several years during the height of the Cold War in the late 70s and early 80s. My job at that time was to translate military communications and to try to anticipate the moves of the German Democratic Republic, which was also known as East Germany. It no longer exists. In the early 1990s, I cross-trained to counterintelligence, where I served the rest of my career, ending, as I said, just after the war in Iraq in 2004. Shortly after I graduated at the top of my class in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence School, I became an instructor at the Army Counterintelligence School. I was named Instructor of the Term and, at one point, Instructor of the Year. I have developed curriculum, dealt with such topics as international law, U.S. civil and military law, the history of interrogation in the U.S. and worldwide, rapport building, various interrogations approaches, and so forth. Written interrogation guidelines and policy manuals, I want to make a point about that, at least in the United States. The first day of training in the United States, in the Army, and in law enforcement, the rules are given to our students from day one. I know there's been a lot of talk in the press, and I'm sure even here in Brazil, if you read the press about the United States or look at the internet, about how some folks were confused. And they didn't really know what the Geneva Convention might have been or what their rules might have been and what they could or could not do. I'm here to tell you, as an instructor and a soldier and an ex-counterintelligence agent, that is what's known as a lie. That's false. They're given that information on the very first day of basic training, and it's hammered into their thick heads every single day throughout their entire military career, and including intelligence school, where they have to know those kinds of things. The rules of law, the rules of interrogation, are something that are core and basic to the U.S. Army and every law enforcement agency that I'm aware of. So that's just not true. There are no what's known as gray areas. As I said, my last military assignment was in Operation Iraqi Freedom at the beginning of 2003. I deployed to Iraq as a CI special agent with the Massachusetts Army National Guard, and I served as a team leader of a counterintelligence team made up of intelligence operatives such as myself, analysts in the intelligence area, and translators. The team itself was known as a Tactical Human Intelligence Team, or THT. We operated out of what is known as Camp Anaconda, which was a large Iraqi Air Force base located about 75 miles northwest of Baghdad. While I was there, I either conducted and or supervised well over 2,000 interrogations of detainees, ranging from Iraqis to Saudis to Iranians to Turks to Jordanians, Syrians, you name it. They came into the area, they tried to kill us, they got interrogated. And I'll say here now, and I'll say it probably through the rest of the program, that my team and others like mine were able to develop some incredible intelligence, some very, very useful information, and never during my entire tour there and all those thousands of investigations, or interrogations rather, did anyone lay hands on a prisoner, on a detainee. Yes, I know the stories, and I'll get to some of those a little later. But we never did. We didn't have to. We played by the rules. No, it's not easy. It's very, very hard. In fact, it's very, very difficult. Some interrogations take days, and I'm talking 24 hours a day. We'll get to that whole thing, too, about sleep deprivation. But the fact is, it does work. You do not have to lay hands on somebody. You don't have to threaten mock executions. You don't have to threaten to execute their families. You don't have to break their bones, their skulls, any of that stuff. You don't have to. I know you'd like to. And by the way, I did invite Jack Bauer here today. He's a friend of mine, but he could not make it. He had an interrogation, I believe. And so he's not going to be here. I'm sorry. You don't have to do that. My team actually located and detained one of the 55 playing card Iraqis. I don't know how many folks remember during the war, we made up a list of playing cards with the top fugitives from Iraq. from Saddam all the way down to his ministers of defense, finance, the interior, whatever. My team caught one of those. Other teams I work with caught many, many others. We recovered hundreds of tons of munitions, meaning weapons and ammunition of all kinds, and tons, I mean warehouses full of classified top secret documents. So it does work. We operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we interacted with Iraqis at all levels, from regional governors to mayors to heads of the intelligence service, the Mukhabarat, over in Iraq. I talked to assassins, clerks, farmers, you name it, they all got the same treatment. I operated in what was known as the Sunni Triangle, which is the center part of Iraq, which was during the war and is now the most volatile area. There never was a calm time in the Sunni Triangle. We got shot at and mortared every single day from day one. And in fact, my base that I operated out of, Camp Anaconda, was affectionately known as Camp Mortaritaville. So if any of you have ever heard of Jimmy Buffett in this side of the hemisphere, it's a play on words for Margaritaville. But we got our mortars every day, twice a day, so it was never very calm. I was there at the beginning of the war, and I really did see the Iraqi people greet us with open arms. And yes, flowers and kisses and hugs. That stuff really did happen. It wasn't a figment of Vice President Cheney's imagination. That happened. However, I also was there a short 2-3 months later, in the late spring of 2003, when that started to go sour. When they started throwing rocks at us, and then cans, and then anything they could lay their hands on, and then started shooting at us, and then putting bombs in the road and calling us occupiers. There were several reasons for that, but one of the main reasons that happened was because of the abusive interrogation techniques that some units of the United States Army used. Why do I say that? Is it my personal opinion? Yes. However, it's based on facts, because I interviewed hundreds of Iraqis, again, at all different levels of society, and they told me that for a fact. And these were people that some of them liked us very much and cooperated with us. Some of them did not like us. However, to a person, they told us that when their family members, their wives, their husbands, their children, their nephews and nieces and daughters started disappearing in the middle of the night, rounded up by U.S. troops, and didn't come back again for days or weeks or months, or came back with bruises or broken bones, they started rethinking the Americans and the occupation and what we were really doing there. And they put up with it for a long time. They really did. And then they didn't like it anymore. That, coupled with the fact that there was no electricity for the most part, and it gets very hot in Iraq in the summer. There was no useful plumbing. There was no useful sewage system. There were no jobs. There was no money. So you couple that with some abusive interrogation techniques, and you have a recipe for disaster. And that's what happened in the late spring and summer of 2003. At this point, I know I'm going to be saying, and I maybe perhaps already said, some things that may sound very liberal, maybe soft-hearted on the victims of interrogations. Let me just say for the record now that I'm not, and in fact, on my tombstone, they're probably going to put the line that some people just need to be shot. So I'm not a liberal. I just thought I'd make that comment. What I'm going to do during the rest of this paper is talk in 3 parts. The first is going to deal with the organization of the United States military intelligence as it relates to the collection of battlefield or tactical intelligence. And part 2 is going to talk about the U.S. Army medical branch, the doctors and psychologists and so forth that work with us in the intelligence gathering and interrogations area. The last part's going to talk about my eyewitness accounts of these 2 branches in action on the battlefields of Iraq in 2003 and the accounts given to me by other CI agents as well. So I'm not really talking out of school here. I'm not quoting any unnamed sources or articles that I read about. This is based on eyewitness facts at the time. And I want to note here right now, and maybe again later on in the paper, that all the statements and opinions I give are mine. They don't represent the United States Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or any branch of the United States of America. Some people, especially in Washington, D.C., get very uncomfortable with that. So I'm speaking on my own as someone that's been there and done that. I'm also going to try to talk a little bit at some point about the situation here in Brazil again in terms of police and some of the concerns with interrogations, torture, and so forth. Every branch of the United States military has its own intelligence branch. However, the U.S. Army by far has the largest intelligence branch of any service. There are thousands of analysts, linguists, and agents, such as myself, that are assigned to over 130 countries all around the world. The U.S. Army also runs the largest foreign language training institute in the U.S. military and perhaps in the country, which is known as the Defense Language Institute, located in Monterey, California. I am a graduate of that school in the German language and culture. I was there in the 1980s, and I can tell you that the instruction is first-rate. Students graduate from that school at or very near the fluency level in foreign languages. So why do we have a problem in the United States getting Arabic linguists to go to such places as Iraq? I'll get to that. The United States military and the United States government knew since at least the first Gulf War, as we call it, back in the early 1990s, that we had a severe problem of Arab linguists. We didn't have very many. In fact, I believe to this day, and my numbers may be slightly off, but to this day, the FBI has less than 50 Arab linguists in the entire FBI, and that's probably an exaggeration. It's probably 20 or 30. The CIA, there are many offices in the Middle East where there are no CIA operatives, or at least full-time case officers, that speak Arabic. And this has been going on for many years. It's a sore point with me because it's very difficult to operate in a foreign country, as I know from being here in Brazil and many other countries, when you don't speak the language. And if you're trying to get information out of people and you have to depend on local interpreters, you're really risking a great deal. So that's the situation we've been in, and we still are in the Army. It's a continuing problem. I just want to let you know, on a personal note, actually, I volunteered to go to the Army's language school right after 9/11 and learn Arabic. I was already a graduate, as I said. Paperwork was ready to go, and I tried for over 1 year to get to go to the Defense Language Institute. And they literally couldn't figure out how to process the paperwork to get me there. And 48 hours before I deployed to Iraq, I was told, "Congratulations, your application's been approved, you can go, but unfortunately you have to go to Iraq and fight a war." So I did, and I still don't know how to speak Arabic. Most of the intelligence resources in the U.S. Army, however, consist of analysts who work in various capacities, but who all have one main focus, and that is to sort through the volumes of raw intelligence that come across their desk every day in their areas of expertise. They divide the world up into different areas, and that's their focus for their entire career. The areas of intelligence that we work in are known as signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, which is the photographs you get from satellites, electronic intelligence, technical intelligence, and open source intelligence. The other side of the intelligence branch that I want to talk about, for the most part from now on, is the human intelligence branch, or humans. Human intelligence has to do with collecting information from every other source except the ones that I just talked about. It's the non-technical way of gathering intelligence, whether that's a police officer on the street talking to somebody that he needs to find out what's going on, a suspect in an interrogation, a soldier on the battlefield, what have you. Yes, this involves the area of spying and counter-spying. My job as a counterintelligence agent, my main focus was to catch spies. That's what I did. We operate as kind of the CIA of the Army. We recruit agents, and we train them, we pay them, and they report to us, and hopefully they go back to the bad guy, and they report on the bad things the bad guy wants to do to us before they can do it. And that's our job. And that's human intelligence. But that, again, that's interrogations. That's at the police officer level, that's at the federal agent level, the special agent, whatever you want to call it. It's all human intelligence, and it's critical to a police department, a prison system that wants to keep a handle on things, and certainly to intelligence agencies. And I can tell you right now, it's the one area, the main area, that most police departments, and certainly on the investigative side, and most intelligence agencies fall down on. They're very weak on. If they can get the budget, they tend to like the electronic gadgets, the fancy, really kind of cool stuff that you see in movies. Today we're fighting what I call the first war of intelligence. This isn't World War II. This isn't Vietnam. This isn't even the first Gulf War. Nobody's going to be shooting big cannons and tanks and big naval battles and so forth. This is a war of spies. This is a war of intelligence. You're not going to catch or intercept a communication between some of these Islamic extremists when they're sitting in a cave somewhere communicating with each other and not using a cell phone, and where they're transmitting their information on someone sitting on the back of a donkey. You're not going to be able to intercept that information, and you're not going to be able to get inside their head and find out why they're doing what they're doing, which is the most important part, by the way, and what they're going to do before they do it. The most you can do with the other kinds of fancy electronic, technical, and expensive intelligence is find out after the fact what happened, and then conduct an investigation. In other words, as we like to say, it's playing catch-up. And doing it after the fact, that's not the way to go. In the U.S. Army, interrogations are conducted by specially trained interrogators who are either at the enlisted, non-commissioned officer level, which means sergeants, or warrant officers who are between the highest level of sergeant and second lieutenant. Commissioned officers, if there are any here, I'm sorry, but they do not conduct interrogations in the United States Army. Why? They're not trained. They don't go to the same schools as real interrogators do at the lower levels. It's just like in the police department, and anybody in law enforcement here can tell you this. The more you go up the chain of command, the less work you do. That's why you go up the chain of command, I guess. But any street cop knows that who does the real police work? The street cop, the guy on the street. It's the same in the Army. The real work is done by special agents who actually go out and do the investigations, do the interrogations, put the intelligence together, put the cuffs on people, write the reports, and actually do the job. The officers supervise that, laughingly at times, but they supervise it. So the point is, they don't do the interrogations. The interrogations and all the intelligence training in the United States Army is conducted at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I have been an instructor in the Army's interrogation class, as well as the counterintelligence class. In the Army, and I'm staying on this point obviously a little longer, commissioned officers who try to do interrogations almost always fail, and fail very, very badly, because they don't have the training. However, they think that it's their job to successfully accomplish the mission, get the intelligence, get the information, and so they go in there anyway. And that, my friends, is where you find a lot of the stories that leak out into the press on botched and abusive investigations and sometimes torture, such as the now infamous Abu Ghraib. I'm sure most of you have heard about Abu Ghraib. I served under the intelligence commander for Abu Ghraib, whose name is Thomas M. Pappas. Thomas M. Pappas was named in the General Taguba report of May 2004 as the person most probably responsible for the abuse, mistreatment, and torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib. He, of course, was not prosecuted. He was given immunity to testify against the lower-ranking guards and what they did, even though he was in command, wrote the policies, wrote the procedures, and was ultimately responsible. They're serving several years in the military penitentiary of Leavenworth, and he, I believe, is still in Germany, about to retire as a full colonel on a pretty hefty salary. Anyway, I served under Colonel Pappas and dealt with him almost every day. He was the commander of my unit. U.S. Army interrogators and police officers should work in two-person interrogation teams. If you are working as an interrogator in a one-person team, you're wrong. Why? Because you can't hear as much. You can't listen, ask questions, and then write down. You need a scribe. And that's somebody that writes down, by the way, the information that you're talking about. You need somebody to write it while you're talking, and keep that team throughout the entire interrogation, or you're going to go wrong. Let me speed up here, because as you can tell, I can probably talk quite a bit about this, but I will speed up. We're going to have time for questions and answers later, so please, if I don't get to an area that you're very interested in, hold on to it, and I will get to it. I want to jump ahead to one point about interrogations. I've mentioned that I never or saw or condoned or allowed abusive or torture in any interrogations that I conducted. And I'll just give you one brief example of an interrogation method that I used that worked dozens, maybe hundreds of times. I worked with a team member who was another counterintelligence agent. And he was a Hispanic gentleman from California. And by his own admissions, he was not the best-looking guy. And I would have him sit at the table with me as the scribe, and all I would tell him is, Jose, don't say a word. I don't want you to say anything. I don't care what I say. I don't care what he says. I want you to just sit there like this. And he did. And he sat there, and I said, all I want you to do is implant in your brain one thought. You want to bite this guy's head off. Don't say anything. Don't move. Just sit there. Kind of like that gentleman right in the middle over there, but that's okay. Very serious. And he did. And you know what? He didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to say anything. I never threatened anybody. He just asked who that person is. What's his problem? I said, I don't know. Maybe he doesn't like you. I don't know. He's got a bad day. He didn't sleep. And they would imagine all kinds of things. Of course, this doesn't happen in a minute or 5 or 10 or maybe even an hour. It takes a while. But you play off of that. I'm using that as an example because, folks, it works. It worked. Things like this. You don't have to beat people or break, chairs over their heads or anything like that. That worked. You put the fear in his head. And he just, after a while, he wanted to say something, just not to look at Jose's ugly face. And that's a fact. So that's one of the methods that I use that can be employed. Okay, the United States Army also has a medical branch that I mentioned. Doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and so forth. What's happening in a big controversy right now is the Army of the United States is using psychologists and doctors and other healthcare professionals to assist in the preparation of interrogations. This can mean something as simple as going through a detainee's record and trying to look for weak spots in their mental health background, their medical background, and so forth, and make suggestions, or as far as even giving drugs, medicines, some kind of injection to try to assist in the interrogation process. This has caused a huge uproar in the United States, and it's a continuing issue that I'm actually, like I said, involved in. And I'll say right now for the record, since I'm having to go a little faster than I wanted, I do not condone medical personnel of any kind assisting in an interrogation. Why? An interrogator that's correctly trained doesn't need a doctor to tell him or her what to do. Doesn't need a psychologist to tell him or her what to do. Whether you're a policeman or whether you're in the military, you don't need it. In fact, you should kick them out. They don't know as much as you do. And they're just going to harm it. And it's wrong. It's morally wrong. People expect doctors, at least I do, to help me. I don't want them to go peering through my record to figure out a really good way that they're going to assist somebody to torture me. And again, I'm not a liberal. I've had people in my interrogation room that if I could, I would have shot them in the head. I would have brought them to the gallows. But you don't do that. That's not the laws of war. That's not what you're about, whether a police officer or as a soldier. I advocate that in any police situation, any interrogation situation, any military situation, medical personnel are not involved. And in the military branch, and this could go for Brazil, this is specifically about the United States Army though, I'm going to go one step further. Because of the abuses that happened at Abu Ghraib, that happened at Guantanamo Bay, which we also call Gitmo, I'm advocating here now that the intelligence branch, the human intelligence branch specifically of the United States Army, be removed from the chain of command of the United States Army. They're under too much pressure from combat commanders to produce information that's just not there. And that leads to coercion, abuse, and maybe even torture. And it certainly doesn't lead to any good intelligence. Take it out, keep the same people, separate chain of command, all the way up through an intelligence general, and then on up to an assistant or deputy secretary of defense for intelligence. That's it. Combat commanders no longer can give the orders, because right now, folks, in the U.S. Army, a second lieutenant right out of West Point can give an order to a colonel in intelligence or a doctor, if they want to countermand an order that they have, because it's a combat situation. And it happens all the time. That's wrong. That has to stop. And I know I'm probably up against it. Let me just finish on one note. I've worked as a police officer, trainer, instructor, curriculum development, special agent at the local, state, and federal levels. I've been involved in, as I said, thousands of investigations, and I've also consulted to various departments. And in the end, I'm offering, and I have offered my services to the American Psychological Association in their attempts to have all of their psychologists be barred from working for the Department of Defense. And I hear today to any of the law enforcement agencies offer my services as a consultant if you think that my experience may or may not help you. And because I know in the police departments right now, not so much the military, you have some of the same problems that we did and we still do. So I just want to leave that as an open-ended kind of a comment. And other than that, I want to thank you for being a great audience and for having me here today. Thank you.